All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Just hit me up in the chat if you can hear me okay. Just want to know that the audio's coming through all right. What's up, Mohammed? Can you guys hear me all right? I'm going to get into the feedback very shortly. And if you're a student who just finished your HSC, congratulations. First of all, huge effort to get through that. Must feel amazing. Thanks, Mohammed. But I will also just be deconstructing at some stage here the one of the English questions that was in the HSC paper, because someone actually asked about a question that was almost identical. So we'll go through the 2023 HSC question for the common mod. Brody, that's amazing. Finished today. One of the best feelings, especially if you've been working hard. There's nothing more satisfying than finishing like a 3 to 4 week block of exams. So congratulations for that. Can hear me well. Fantastic. Did anyone else finish? Anyone else finish the HSC recently? Who is doing the HSC for 2024? Who's just started the common mod? Who's just started year 12? Just let me know in the comments so I can gauge where everyone is at. But I will be breaking down some questions, including one of the 2023 HSC English questions for the common module. So again, if you're a student who just finished their HSC and you're curious about how I would have broken down one of the questions at least, I'll do a more detailed breakdown later of all of the questions that I think we're interested in. But yeah, so there's a few students I can see who are just starting the HSC now this term. So all the best with that. But, you know, we're here for the ride. Jeddle's here. Lots of content on the YouTube channel, on our socials, on our website. So definitely a lot more content to come to help you through the journey. All right, so I'm going to be sharing my screen in a second, but I just want to see, does anyone have any questions up front about any assessments they're doing, any general questions about how something works? Because you're so early into the term, and a lot of you will just be doing the common module to begin with, because you have to do the common module this term. Some schools are doing the craft of writing for the first couple of weeks, which is an interesting way of doing it, and they'll probably pepper it into some other terms as well. But most of you will be doing the common mod this term. But because you're new to it, maybe you're confused about how the whole thing works. So maybe it's worth me just breaking down the whole exam structure and how it all fits together. Let me know if you're interested in that. But general questions are welcome right now for the first 5 to 10 minutes. General questions, and give me some feedback. If you just did the HSC, I'd love to know how you went. But just some quick hellos, because I recognize some other people. Luke Jansen's familiar name. Thanks for coming back on. Always appreciated. Muhammad. We got Horse iOS. We got Sori. I'm just going off the names. We got CP. Teen Mess. Jettle is a lifesaver. Much appreciated. Thank you very much. Beautiful review. If you need resources for the studies, jettle.com is there with our most extensive written resources. But otherwise, YouTube, you know how much free content we put out there as well. But if you want to go that little bit deeper, the website's there to help you there as well. Okay, so Brody says, what do you think Band 6 scaling would be like for those two papers? Oh, that's an impossible question, Brody. It's all going to depend on relative performance. So once they know the kind of the mark distribution, then they'll work out what is the cutoff mark for a band 6. They have to, it's a bell curve, which means there has to be so many students. There has to be a certain percentage of students that receive a band 6. Even if everyone bombed out in the exam, whoever bombed out the least is going to get a band 6. So if the highest mark in the state was a 60, that person's going to get scaled up to like a 99 or something. So it's impossible to know. It's all going to depend on how the marks are distributed, but more or less they're the same every year. So I don't think there's anything significant in terms of scaling for English in general. As I've said in other videos, English is one of the best scaling subjects for your ATAR if you can get a high band 5 or a band 6. Even at the lower bands as well, it tends to do better than a lot of other subjects. not the higher maths ones, they scale very well, but in terms of how it contributes to your ATAR, which kind of happens behind the scenes, I'm not talking about how it scales to become your final HSC mark. Like, say you end up with a 95, what does that 95 then become to contribute to your ATAR, your score out of 500? You don't actually see that score. That happens in the background. But English is an incredible subject for scaling, especially English Advanced. But if you do well in English Standard as well, it's just way harder to do well. When I say do well, it's way harder to get a band 6 in English Standard. I think it's just around the 1% mark. It might be less than 1%. It's definitely less than 2% of students who do standard that get a band 6. It's about 15% of students generally in standard who get a band 5 or 6. So that means 85% of students who do standard get below an 80. And that's why I always say, if you think you can put in the work for advanced and make it work and will try hard, you're probably better off doing advanced. But that's not to demoralize anyone who's just finished doing standard. You can still go well. There's still 15% there. And also you might be happy with a 70, and maybe you'll have a better chance of getting a 70 in standard than advanced. But that's, only a very small percentage, less than 5% of the state typically get less than a 70 in English Advanced. So if you're in the top 95%, you've secured your 70. And I think almost 2/3 of the state get a band 6. Oh, sorry, not a band 6. 2/3 of the state get a band 5 or 6, so above an 80 in English Advanced some years. Okay, so it's a significant percentage. The majority of students who do advanced get 80 or above. Okay, the majority of students who do standard get below 80. So that's the difference in terms of scaling, and that's all I can offer you on the scaling piece. I don't know how those particular papers will do. It's just going to depend on how everyone does overall. And if heaps of people do really well, then it's going to be harder to get a band 6, because only so many people are allowed to get a band 6, basically, to fit a bell curve, right? They need majority of people to get, a band 5, say, in advanced, or a band 4 in standard. It has to match that distribution. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, CP says, how to balance school leadership and personal life. Okay, well, that's a big question. How do you balance those three things, school, leadership, personal life? Well, I think leadership and school kind of go hand in hand, but maybe not, because you might have a leadership role, I assume, and you're trying to balance that with school work. So there's the academic part of school, and then there's your leadership role at school. So talking about that, I mean, personally, I was a prefect, but I wasn't like the school captain. So I don't have that personal experience, but I do know a lot of people who were school captains. Like my brother was a school captain. My girlfriend was a school captain. So there are people around me that have had that experience and they've related. So I can only really go off their kind of accounts of how that was. And what they said was it really depends on how much you put in. So if you, I know my brother was always putting in a lot of work behind the scenes, when it came to the groups, what do you call it? Student representative council and initiatives at the school, and organizing some of those special days throughout the year. And then there were speeches throughout it, and some other initiatives that you were doing for charity and social enterprises. So the leadership piece is really about how much you want to give to it. But in terms of balancing it, it seems to be that it's something you have to do in the hours that you're not studying it. It doesn't seem to be something that you're treating in the same way you would your study schedule. Like, I think it's like you go to school, you make sure you schedule in time to do all of your work as you would even if you weren't a leader. And then the leadership thing is an extra role you take on. Sometimes it will have to be prioritized, but for the most part, I think there's just a few things throughout the year that will come up where you have to give it a lot of your attention, but otherwise it's something you just chip away at and stay involved in a way that makes sense. So a bit of a vague answer there, but you just need to structure that accordingly. But I would kind of mold it around your academic schedule, your study schedule, unless there is a specific event that requires all of your attention for a little bit of time in terms of your leadership role. But yeah, I'm not the best person to give you advice on that. But in terms of leadership in general, I mean, it's a big area. I think you can be a leader in the way you conduct yourself at school and in your studies, and it's more about what you're doing all the time and how you're being a leader. So leadership for me, in a general sense, is more about how you carry yourself day to day throughout the day. But I was just trying to give some examples of specific responsibilities that you might have as a school captain or as a particular uh, type of leader at a school, right? But generally, being a leader, I mean, just be a leader, like represent the values that you want to represent, right? Now, personal life, social life, and school. That's always an interesting one. I mean, I never really compromised my social life. I think it's imperative. So my my answer here is actually pretty simple. Like, you shouldn't really have to sacrifice that much on the social side if you are just being efficient and disciplined throughout the week, getting the work done that you've been set in the time slots that you have set, schedule your time accordingly. And then Saturday nights, go out. I didn't miss any parties. There were plenty of 18ths when I was in year 12. So go out, enjoy yourself. Some weekends, we were out 2 times a week. All of Saturday for me for a lot of the year was around school sport. I was playing rugby, going and supporting the teams prior, going and watching other sports. So from memory, I would say I was only doing a couple of hours of work on a Saturday, and then the rest of it was sport, school activities, going out with friends, and then Sunday I would try and knuckle down a bit and make sure I got at least 3 or so hours done. But it depends. If I had an assessment, maybe I was spending all day and night on that particular assessment for that week. But if it was just a standard weekend, just mandatory few hours catching up on things or doing maths homework or something, right? No need to compromise social life. I would just concentrate it on the weekends, and wouldn't be going out during the week. But these are things you already know, right? Your weekdays and weeknights are all about getting home, getting your work done straight away, making sure you spend time with your family as well at the same time, and getting to bed at a reasonable hour. And then your weekends are like your outlet, your escape, where you can go out with friends, hang out, and not have the guilt, right? Just be okay with seeing friends and family and socializing on the weekend. Just be really productive and disciplined during the week. That's kind of the secret, I think. All right. Hopefully that answers that in some way. Okay. How to begin drafting base essays? Well, that's a really good question. Well, the first thing there is you need to have a draft question. A lot of people try and do generic or general essays, vague essays, without a question. They think, oh, I'm just going to create this base, this essay that doesn't have a particular question so that I can adapt it to any question I get. And you almost can do that by creating a question. You just have to create the right question. So you create a question that is general, but don't write a general essay without a question, because there is a subtle difference there, right? One of those essays actually has some direction. It actually has some focus. It's actually been designed to respond to a particular question, which puts you in the right mindset. Whereas the draft essay that doesn't have a practice question associated with it is intentionally vague, and it doesn't satisfy one of the core things that you need to tick off in an exam, which is respond to the question. So even though you might fear creating a draft essay to a specific question because you think, well, I'm not going to get that question, so now this essay is irrelevant to a large extent. You might be thinking that, but actually that's not quite right. You create a draft essay to a general question, still cover all the core things you want to do, but at least have elements where you link your essay directly to the question. And then that has programmed you to adapt to any question that you get, because you've already done it once. You'll be able to do it the next time. And that's a skill that you'll learn over time in terms of tweaking and adjusting that base essay. So my advice is, don't be afraid to choose a question that you're comfortable with. Don't choose like a super niche, abstract question that you're really unlikely to be asked in an exam. Use a nice general question that sits well with your understanding of the unit and create the essay from there. Then you need to have a structure. And for the common module, I would always recommend having a 3-body paragraph structure, unless you get a different kind of assessment. A lot of you might be getting multimodal assessments this term, where you have to do some kind of audio visual component. Maybe it's a podcast that you have to record. But even then, it's basically a spoken essay. It's just the tone and the language has to be adjusted a little bit. If you're doing a podcast, then you have to make sure that it's more personal. It's a little bit more conversational. It might have some flair, some kind of quirky aspects to it that are going to be engaging for the audience. But overall, the substance needs to be much like an essay in terms of the quality of the analysis and what you're saying about the text and how you're responding to the question. So 3 paragraphs, 3 body paragraphs for your common mod essay and any essay you do, unless you're doing a comparative essay between 2 different texts, in which case, which is likely for module A for your for English Advanced, where you'll compare to, you might want to do 4 body paragraphs for that structure. Otherwise, 3 body paragraphs for any essay that's just about one text. And when I say one text, you might be doing a set of poems, like you might be studying Slessor, or when you do module B, you might be studying T.S. Eliot, and you'll study multiple poems, but they're still one text. That's all one text. They're almost like chapters in a book, right? So 3 body paragraphs, create your structure, choose a good question was step 1. Make sure you have a question. And I'll give you some advice on what I think are good questions that will help you cover it. And then just follow a neat structure in terms of your analysis. I mean, there are a lot of steps actually here. I might not go through all of them right now, but I can certainly cover some more things as I go through some examples of breaking down the question. So I think the main takeaways from drafting an essay are: make sure you have a question. Choose a question that is an ideal question for you. Like, if I got a question in an exam, because you are going to get a question, what would I love to have as a question? And make sure it's a realistic question that's based on the module description, like the rubric. It has some of those keywords in it that you've looked at. Okay, have the question. Make sure you have a strong framework, a strong structure. And the structure I always recommend, in addition to the 3 body paragraphs, is to focus firstly on a problem. So what's the core tension? What is the core tension that you're exploring? And typically this is established at the beginning of the text. So you can almost follow it chronologically in terms of how you select your evidence throughout your essay. And then the second body paragraph can be about the consequence of that tension. And it might even be the struggle as a consequence. So what happens as a result of that problem? So maybe someone lives in a world where they're oppressed and they have no freedom. Okay, set that up in your first paragraph. Second one, well, individuals then respond in this way. So what's the problem? How do people respond to that problem? And then the third paragraph would be, is there a resolution? How does this all end up? So what was the tension? What was the consequence of that tension, the direct consequence for people? How did they respond? How did they struggle against it? And then finally, in the third body paragraph, was there a resolution? What was it? Was there a rebellion of some kind? Were people able to set aside their differences and find unity? There's all of these possibilities, but the text that you're studying will typically follow that progression in all cases, right? All texts have that. They establish a complication, there's a problem. Then there is a kind of struggle, there's a journey as a result of that. And then there's ultimately some kind of resolution. Maybe there's not a resolution and you need to discuss that. But I would be selecting my evidence chronologically, almost from the beginning, the middle, and the end for my first paragraph, my second paragraph, and my third paragraph as a rule of thumb. I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm not saying you can't use evidence from the start of the text in your last body paragraph, but that's how I would be framing the essay to begin with, because then it gives you material that's likely to be very adaptable to any question. Another key tip that's going to help you to be really adaptable to any essay question that you get asked is to include in your draft base essay, right, your core essay, and you should have one of these for each module that you do throughout your HSC or throughout your studies generally, whatever you're studying. You have one core draft essay for each topic, for each unit. And you want to make sure that the type of evidence you've used is related to those broader compositional components of the text. So the structure of the text, the form of the text. Like if it's a film, what's significant about it being a film? Talk a lot about the cinematography, the way it's shot, the soundtrack. Talk about general techniques, macro techniques, big techniques, we call them, right? And they are going to be adaptable to any question. There's no question that wouldn't allow you to talk about the general form or structure or style of a text. But there are questions where maybe the simile or the metaphor or the personification you were using isn't that relevant. They often are still relevant if you've chosen evidence that ties to the bigger ideas that are explored in the text. But certainly those stylistic elements, like the narrative voice, is it first person narration or third person narration? The general structure, the general style of the text, those components are going to be relevant and useful. They're going to actually give you marks. They're going to improve the quality of your response for almost any question. So include in those draft essays a lot of form, at least one mention of form or style or the genre per paragraph. If you can get more in, get more in. Go for two. Go for two. And combine those broader elements like the voice, the perspective, the structure. If you're doing a play, for instance, is there a soliloquy? Is there a monologue? Are there stage directions that are important? If you're doing a film, the soundtrack, things that are very general, combine those with the more specific techniques that you might find on a particular page in a particular paragraph. Okay. Make sure you balance your evidence in that way. That's going to be a more adaptable essay, and it's going to be a more sophisticated essay because you're covering more elements of the text as a whole. You're appreciating the whole of the text, not just small parts of it by zooming in on certain paragraphs or pages or lines of a poem. That's a big mistake that a lot of students make, actually. They zoom in on all these specific lines in the text and they find the metaphor, they find the hyperbole, they find some very specific technique, and then they put all of those pieces of analysis together and that forms the body paragraph. Now, whilst your points might be quite relevant and effective, the type of evidence you've got there is quite limited. You haven't appreciated the broader composition of the text. Why was it designed in that particular way? Why is it written in first person and not third person? Right? Why does it have that soundtrack? Why are there soliloquies throughout? You need to mix in those specific techniques with the broader ones, and you need to do that every paragraph of every essay you write for year 12, year 11, whatever you're doing. And that is going to give you more balance and more sophistication throughout your analysis. So a bit of a tangent there, but that's a key thing to remember when you're drafting a base essay. Lots of form, lots of general stylistic elements, mention the genre, and make sure you follow that framework if you're unsure of what else to do, which is to make sure you've covered the core problem, you've talked about the response or the consequence of that problem for the individual or for the community at hand. And then the third thing in the third paragraph is to talk about whether there's a resolution. What is that resolution? Why wasn't there a positive resolution? Explore that. And you can almost select your evidence chronologically for those paragraphs. So they're my biggest tips. One other tip, sorry. One other one. It's a massive one, actually. When you start drafting your essay, one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they actually try and write the introduction first. So assuming you have a question that you're using, because you should have a practice question for your core essay, as we've established, they'll then try and write the introduction. How can you write an introduction if you don't know what you're introducing? You don't have anything below the introduction. If I'm looking at a typed page, a blank white page with an essay question at the top, how can I construct an introduction if I haven't even mapped out what I'm arguing? It makes no sense when you think about it. So the first thing that you should write when you do a draft, and after you've kind of consolidated your thoughts and notes, if you have any, you've done your tables of analysis, you've got some quotes, you've thought about the text, you know what it's about, first and foremost. The first thing I would do when it comes to actually writing the essay is to construct your topic sentences. So the first sentence for each of your body paragraphs, because that creates the structure, right? They're the three core points. And then you can write an introduction after you've backed up those points. So then you add in your evidence and you create the body paragraphs, right? And once you've built your body paragraphs in full, then you can go back and say, hey, this is what I'm going to be introducing, because now I've actually written my core argument. I've got my three main points that build on one another. I've got my evidence supporting them, which includes form, but also some specific examples. And now I can tell you confidently what this essay is about. Otherwise, your introduction is going to be very vague and you're going to find it very hard to actually draft it because mentally you don't even know what you're introducing. So I remember I tried to do that once, actually, thinking back now. I was trying to get ahead of the game just before I started year 12. It was in that holiday period before, and I said, I'm going to already start drafting some introductory concepts. I'm going to write some introductions to some past questions and just, get my thoughts down. And I was trying to write these thesis statements, these introductions with nothing below it. And I really struggled with it actually. And it was only in hindsight, looking back at it, that I realized I didn't even know what I was introducing. I was just trying to, tick off the introduction. So I was at least some way through writing a full essay and I was ahead of everyone else or I was ahead of the game. But no, I actually was kind of going backwards. I was doing myself a disservice by confusing myself and not mapping out what are the core arguments based on the problem, the struggle, or the consequence, and then the resolution, and then trying to come up with a nice thesis that kind of ties it all together. Your argument that you'll establish in your introduction ties and threads everything together, but the thread, right? The thread, it comes from your body paragraphs, and the ideas of each of those body paragraphs is embedded or are embedded in the topic sentences, the first sentence. So that's super key. All right, long explanation. Hopefully that helps. How can I find related texts with my prescribed texts? Yeah, good question. So let's talk about related texts. All right, related texts for the common module for text and human experiences usually aren't used in an assessment as a comparison with the prescribed text. So say you're doing 1984 or The Crucible. Normally, an assessment doesn't want you to directly compare them, but some do. I've seen both, right? Comparisons are not really the focus of the common module because, especially if you're doing advanced, you have a comparative study in module A, textual conversations. But I'll try and address it from both angles, right? So, assuming you don't have to do a direct comparison, when you're thinking about a related text, the first thing you want to think about is what text do I know or am I familiar with or can I find that at least has something to do with the core aspects of the rubric? Like, what are some texts I can think about that, just like my prescribed text, also explore an inconsistency in the human experience or inconsistent human emotions or a paradox or that explore corrupt motivations or something like that? Obviously, every text is about human experiences. So it's a bit of a tough one. But if I'm thinking about a related text in practical terms, I'm thinking about ones that will work well with the rubric. So you have to be familiar with that rubric. And I'll pull that up in a second. I might pull it up now, actually, so it's really clear. You want to find one that hits a lot of those points because I've seen a lot of assessments that will actually require you to link the rubric directly to the key terms of the module. So let me just share the screen now, and then I'll give you some ideas for the related texts. Okay, so I'll tell you guys some ideas for the related texts in a second. Let me just pull up the NESA. Let's see if we can get this up. The NESA. Yeah, here we go. Now, can I get... Oh. Okay. So you can see here, this is the common module rubric, right? And what we need to be aware of here are the key terms. So we need to know that, okay, it could ask us about individual or collective human experiences. So my prescribed text is obviously going to be exploring those, but my related text also has to clearly have experiences that are unique to the individual and collective as well. So maybe a community or a group of people, and then like one individual has a particular experience as well. Okay, they examine how texts represent human qualities and emotions. So you need to understand how the emotions are connected to those experiences, and your related text needs to have some clear ones there. I feel like I could go through the whole thing, but that actually might not be as helpful. What I might do is give you an example of a related text. Oh, let me see if I can get back on here. Of a related text that could be useful, right? So, and who asked this? Suri. Let's say I don't know what text you're doing, but let's say you're doing The Crucible. Okay, The Crucible. So if you're doing The Crucible, you're thinking about, okay, there's oppression going on there. There is a lot of hysteria. There's paranoia. And people, aren't able to determine what's true, and they aren't able to speak the truth because then they'll be isolated from the community. And, basically there's just this gross violation of truth and justice. So that's what that text is about. So if you're doing The Crucible, it's about injustice. It's about the truth being kind of outlawed almost, and people being isolated for standing up for the truth and being killed ultimately. So if you then wanted a related text for that, it doesn't have to be about the same thing. That's what I've been trying to say. It doesn't have to be about the same thing. you could choose something else. Like I think one we once did was Of Mice and Men, Of Mice and Men, right? So Of Mice and Men is a novella. It's a novella. So that's a short story. Okay, very short story, short book, easy to read. Always try and use shorter text if you're not a big reader. Obviously, don't pick a related text that's going to take you weeks, maybe months to get through. Short text novella, Of Mice and Men, John Steinbeck. And that text wasn't about the same thing as The Crucible. It wasn't about the same thing as 1984. It was about its own thing, right? It was about, you know, this is like the Great Depression set in America, 1930s or something like that, and it explored its own themes of like friendship and you know aspirations to achieve the American dream and build a house and have a successful working life, etc. Now that text doesn't have anything to do with the plot of the other ones, and that's okay. But what the student did really well with that text is they connected it to all of those rubric terms really well. So they were able to link the characters to the emotions, to the individual human experiences that they were going through. They were able to say and articulate pretty well what any anomalies were. An anomaly is like something or someone unusual, different from the norm. So who was the anomaly in the story and why? And did anything unusual happen in the story? And almost always the answer is yes. Find out what that is and then make sure you use the word anomaly when you explain it. So it's more about connecting the related text. It's more about finding something that can connect well with those key terms of the rubric. So anomalies, paradoxes, inconsistencies, human motivations and behaviors. It's all on that module description on the NESA site, right? I'm sure a lot of you have looked at it in class. That's what a good related text is. I'll tell you what I'd be looking for as well with a related. I've already said one of the things, a shorter text. I don't want to read a really long book, especially if I'm already studying a book or a prose fiction novel. I don't want to read something that's really long as a related. That's the first thing. The second thing is don't choose a related text that is of the same form as your prescribed text. So if you're doing The Crucible, which is a play, don't choose another play. Choose a different text type. Choose a film. Choose a novella, right? Choose, it could be maybe a short animation. Maybe it's a graphic novel. But don't choose a text that is the same text type or form as your prescribed text, because you're not then able to show the marker a diversity of technical skill. You can't show them that you know a broader set of techniques and you know how to handle texts of different nature. So if you want to be able to impress the marker basically, and if you can show them that you can analyze a play just as well as you can analyze a film, then that's going to be better than showing them that you can analyze a play twice. So don't limit yourself by choosing the same text type. So your related text has to be of a different form to the prescribed text. Choose a short text. Poems are always good. And make sure that if you go and look at the module description, the rubric for text and human experiences on the NESA site, make sure you can draw clear links between your text and that one. Unless the assessment that you get this term with the related text explicitly, which means clearly asks you to compare the two texts, then all you have to do is be able to say, here's another example of a text that explores human experiences, and here's how it does so. And you do the same analysis and you connect it back to the module. Okay, so that's how you should think about it. The third thing to note with related texts is that related texts are not relevant for your trials or your final HSC. So related texts will only be relevant, I should say almost always, related texts will only be relevant in the first assessment on the common module. Then you get rid of the related text, and a lot of students struggle with this. They forget to update their draft essay because their draft essay had one paragraph on a related text and 2 paragraphs on a prescribed text, but they didn't they didn't substitute out the third paragraph on the related text for another paragraph on the prescribed text. So remember to update your draft after you do that first assessment with the related text. Especially if it was a podcast or something, you also need to convert it more to that essay language. So related text will not be in the final exam, will not be in your final HSC. Make sure you understand that really well. Same for trials, unless you get told otherwise by your teacher for some reason. But yes, only one assessment will have it. In terms of how much you need to focus on a related text in an essay, you do I would say it's 2/3 on the prescribed text and 1/3 on the related text. That seems to be what most teachers want. That's what I've noticed as a pattern. But you can always ask your teacher and say, do you want it to be half half, or should I do a little bit more on my prescribed text? Most teachers now seem to be saying do more on the prescribed text, which for me, if you're doing 3 paragraphs, would mean 2 paragraphs on the prescribed text and then 1 on the related. Okay. And you can order that in whatever way it makes sense. But if it's a shorter assessment and you don't have enough words or time to do 3 bodies, maybe you'll do 2 bodies, 1 on each. So it'll just depend on the uh, assessment type and the prescriptions, what they ask you to do, the requirements. Okay, so I do have some things I want to go through in terms of breaking down the question. I see some people noting that. Let me just go back up. I don't want to miss anything crucial. Great to see so much engagement here. A lot of questions. Okay, and sorry, S-Ray. That is confusing. Okay, Jack says, how complex would a multimodal presentation need to be to get full marks for that part of the criteria? How complex would a multimodal presentation need to be? Hopefully not complex at all. I mean, depends what you mean by the question. I'm kind of being facetious there. Obviously, you want your multimodal presentation to be simple to understand. It should be very clear what you're saying. If you mean how sophisticated it has to be in terms of the visual and audio components, not that much, but definitely worth putting in the effort to go further than you would normally. Okay, that would be my answer. So, if I was doing some kind of multimodal assessment, I would definitely kind of upskill early on with my Canva skills or my audio skills so I could edit things in and add some music and sound effects. I would learn those things, to be honest. I would recommend doing that because, of course, it's going to give you an edge. But the main thing that matters with a multimodal is that you have a great argument and that you have your analysis there and you link things to context and you use form. Have a great essay. Make sure that the tone is appropriate to the audience. Make sure the language has been adapted for whatever the style of assessment it is. So if it's a podcast, it needs to sound like a podcast. A little bit more conversational, still have the sophisticated analysis. But yeah, in terms of the complexity of the actual presentation, I would say definitely go further than is comfortable in terms of learning a few extra skills. Incorporate some additional sound effects. Soundtrack always helps, but make sure it doesn't, the volume has to be set. Make sure it doesn't kind of trump or overshadow your voice. The most important thing, as I just said, is the spoken essay that you're delivering effectively, or the podcast that you're delivering, but it's basically a different version of a spoken essay. And in terms of the visuals, yes, visuals matter and they want you to have some transitions and some effects. But I think I'll just lean most into the symbolism of things. Have some nice symbols that have a kind of deeper meaning to them, and make sure there's a consistency in your theme across the presentation. So it's not like colors are changing all the time for no reason. Try and stay consistent with the theme, but make sure there is some deeper symbolism involved. That would be the complexity, I guess, the symbolism. Don't just do really obvious things. Like you're trying to say someone's happy, so there's an emoji of a smiley face, a yellow face with a smile. Like, okay, that's not complex enough. Try and make sure that the symbolic images you use, if you're using images, actually portray some kind of complexity. So the complexity is in the symbolism, but the symbols themselves don't have to be super complex. Just find a picture or an image that's appropriate, but it's clearly conveying something beyond just happiness, sadness. Maybe it's a struggle. Maybe it's a tension. Try and lean into the tension aspect and conflicts. Things that are kind of pulling from different directions. If you can show those tensions in different ways, visually, symbolically, I think that's a great way to kind of nail that part of the criteria, that part of the assessment. So I hope that helps in that regard, but keep it simple overall in the sense that we want to just hear what you're saying. I want to hear that spoken essay, but cool. Let's have a few minimal, right? Have only very few visuals to support it, but make sure that the symbolism is deeper than the average symbol. Okay, so that's kind of the sweet spot, I think. Don't have too many visuals. Don't have the screen changing all the time. Simple visuals. Maybe it's only 6 slides for the whole 5-minute speech, but they all have a symbol there and it's complex. It's showing attention and you're talking about that tension or talking about that idea as it stays on the screen. Okay. So minimalist approach, but lean into the symbolism and, go that extra mile to learn a few extra skills with audio. And that will probably impress the marker as well. Okay. So again, with recommended related texts, like it could be anything. I think you've got to think about related text in a slightly different way. It's a related text in terms of how it relates to the module, to the common module. It doesn't necessarily have to relate to 1984, although you might find that helpful and an assessment task might require that kind of comparison. But if it's not asking you to compare it, it just wants another example of a text that explores a certain human experience. So you can think about it that way as well. In terms of examples, I mean, yeah, I'm always hesitant to just like give off a couple because then everyone does those two, and it's not that unique. You should just find another text that you like or enjoy. Make sure it's not the same form as we described. I like to go for poems. I'll give you a good one actually. I believe the poem's called Odysseus, or let me find. Actually, it's not Odysseus. Sorry, that's from something Ozymandias. Ozymandias. Let me just pull it up for you. Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. Yeah, that's a good poem. Okay, have a look at this. So I'll share my screen with you. Good poem, simple. Here we go. Look at this. That's how long the related text is. Well, that's an easy one to read, but it's a poem, and people often take poetry for granted. Some people actually do admit that poetry is really complicated. There's a lot in it. You have to really break down every word, every line. You have to look at the whole thing, the style, the voice. But, read that. That's an interesting story about someone who's tried to, preserve their legacy. They were such an impactful figure in their life, but they've become this statue, right, that's slowly withering away. And the idea is that no matter how impactful you are as a person, eventually the world is going to forget you. Which is, might sound grim, but it's also kind of liberating. But the point here is that you can't sustain a legacy forever. But if you really zoom into each part of that poem, there's a lot of great stuff to relate to: emotions, motivations, like the motivation to preserve your legacy over time, right? Or a contradiction or an inconsistency, right? Well, that motivation to preserve your legacy over time is inconsistent with the transience of matter in the world, right? Like everything decays. So you can't stay, and it's also inconsistent with the transience of human life. You want to preserve your legacy forever, but you're only going to live for a certain amount of time, and people are going to forget. So there's inconsistencies, there'll be paradoxes in there. Anyway, good example of a nice poem. There are other texts like good films that you might want to do. But yeah, I'm reluctant to rattle off too many, only because I don't want to limit you. But if you're really struggling, feel free to put something in the comments below this, and I'll try and get back with a few kind of safe or relevant related texts for you. Okay. Unfortunately, with the multimodal assessments, if you're bad at technology and editing, right? How do you approach a multimodal when you're bad at technology and editing? You're disadvantaged, and that doesn't. But that doesn't mean that you can't get full marks. It doesn't mean that you can't go as well as everyone else. It means that you have to put in more effort than you normally would, or more effort than everyone else. That's how life works, right? If you don't have a particular skill and others are better at you, it's not like, oh, I can, just do the same as I always do and still go as well. It's like, no, in this particular area, you are starting behind, and you need to make up that ground by putting in extra work and learning the skills. Now, the good thing about the multimodals, right, is that you only have to upskill a little bit. So go on YouTube and say, how do I make a multimodal presentation, or how do I create a cool Canva presentation, right? Get used to canva.com. Fantastic resource for creating graphics and slides and effects and transitions, and it does it really easily. A lot of people use PowerPoint as well, but Canva has amazing graphics and options there, animations. It will do a lot of that work for you. So Canva is a great piece of software, and then go and look up on Google and YouTube a few tricks, few tips on how to get better, and how do you integrate sound into a file. Like, how am I going How am I going to show a slideshow with sound behind it? Okay, you have to Google that. And, it doesn't come to you naturally or you don't know it already. But trust me, if you watch a 5-minute explanation or less on YouTube about how do I create a video with a soundtrack or with audio, it will show you exactly how to do it. So you just need to put in some extra work to do it. And it's definitely worth doing that because you might have a great essay or a great piece of analysis that you're presenting, but because it's multimodal, you'll lose a few marks if you don't have the presentation to back it up. So you just need to start the assessment earlier than you normally would. Make sure you do a bit of research, try a few things out. And once you've kind of got a bit of sound in there, some nice graphics because you're using nice templates on Canva, don't try and start everything from scratch. Then you'll find it much easier. But yeah, Canva is going to be a great one. It already has templates. It already has all the designs on there if you're doing something that involves that kind of visual component like a slideshow. Okay. The common module requires students to look at a related text. For our assessment at school, we need to find a related text. Is this compulsory? Yeah, it's not tested in the HSC because the related text component doesn't align with what NESA want you to really focus on for the common module and all modules. They want you to do a deep analysis on all the text that you're studying. So by the time you get to the final exam, they just want to know about that one prescribed text, one text, full essay, versus 2 texts in the essay where you're not spending as much attention on that prescribed text. Why do you do a related? Because they still want you to study another text so that you understand how the human experience concepts apply to text more generally, because that will also help you with the short answer section, right? When you do short answers, which is 20 marks, just like the essay on the common module is 20 marks, so it's worth the same. That requires you to understand how to apply the module, the rubric, like how do you find anomalies, paradoxes, inconsistencies to different texts. So the related text component kind of helps you do that. It's another example of how a text can represent human experiences. So they want you to kind of get familiar with that process, but then at the end of the day, they want you to show that you can do a deep analysis of one text. So I guess that's their way of balancing out those demands. Okay. Yes, and also the internal assessment thing. I mean, yeah, they want to mark everyone on the same text. That's a good point. Related texts bring in huge variability. Like a marker might happen to know one related text, but then they don't know the other related text and they have to give the kid the benefit of the doubt. And the related text was made up completely, right? So huge variance there with the HSC marking. So an easier way to moderate it and to do fair marking is just to mark everyone on the exact same texts, no random unknown related texts. So that's a good point. Will this Q&A? Yeah, Q&A is always posted. I don't know when exactly it's going to be posted to the channel, but we'll also chop it up later and put it into some components. How would you choose related text for 1984? As I said, I'll come back to you guys on the related text. I think we have other videos on the YouTube about how to pick a related text because, I would want to give you solid recommendations. I have a lot in my head because I have some students that I go through this process with, but I want to make sure I'm giving you really solid examples that are widely applicable. So put something in the comments about related text and I'll get back with a few examples. But Ozymandias, the poem, was a good one because I used to love choosing poems as a related text, as long as you're not doing Slessor because that is already poetry. Again, you can't do the same one. Shorter texts, lots of meaning in them, lots of techniques. That's and clear links to the module description. Okay. They do count towards your ATAR though, I think. Okay. That's in relation to the related. Yeah. Well, they count towards your ATAR in the sense that you would have been internally assessed and then that would have contributed to your rank, which then helps inform your final mark, which then gives you an ATAR. So yeah, it's part of it, but you don't actually do it for your HSC exam, but it is part of it, part of the assessment at the very start. Okay. This is an interesting question. Was English your favorite subject in school? Interesting question. It probably wasn't, if I'm being honest. I was a big maths fan. I did extension 2 maths and I absolutely loved it. But I also loved English because I found that I could apply kind of mathematical framework to it while also tapping into, philosophical interests and curiosities. Not that I was that philosophical in like year 11 or 12. It was more that I just had I liked concepts. I liked being able to, use flashy words and language. I was kind of like that, and I was just like, okay, I want to be able to write well. I want to be able to come up with cool ideas. Even though I couldn't really come up with ideas when I was in year 12, I was just using other people's ideas and critics' ideas, and as you do with research. And I was just getting good at structuring them. Again, linking to my love of mathematics, right? Structuring them into a kind of formula and seeing the beauty in that. But it was only really since finishing school, that I've become, I'm super immersed in English. Obviously, it's the main thing now. So it wasn't my favorite subject in school, which is an interesting thing to think about. It was definitely my best subjects. Yeah, probably English and maths. I was always a big fan of those, but yeah, I the English kind of passion grew deeper over time because you start to be able to think for yourself more once you finish school. It's very hard while you're at school to come up with your own ideas and really question things. And you look back at what you were doing at school, and you're kind of like, I see why they wanted me to look at that, and I see why they wanted me to study Shakespeare, but you don't appreciate it at the time. You just have to kind of go with it and do your best, and use other people's voices to help inform your own. But you only really get your own voice together after school, I think. In most cases, you have some students who already can think independently in that way, which is incredible. But I wasn't one of them. I just was someone who was willing to put in the work to read a lot of other works and figure out how to structure my work, and definitely put in the time to write my own work. I wrote all my own work. It was just the ideas and concepts. I was just had to be like a sponge and figure out how to piece it all together. I was obsessed with the structure and keeping things smooth throughout and all of that. So yeah, that's a quick answer to that. Not a quick answer, actually. It was a pretty long-winded answer. But yeah, I liked both, but I was obsessed with just doing maths in that routine. Okay, so 1984 seems quite overwhelming right now because we are being presented with so many intellectual ideas, themes, and techniques so quickly. It's a lot to take in. Yeah, that's a good point, Luke. So 1984 has great ideas. Like, I love that book, right? I love that novel. It's so relevant to the world we live in today as well. Like, I often, every time someone's talking about something, current affairs or something that's going on in the world, I'm just like 1984. Like, you'll often hear people say that's really Orwellian. Like, that's like George Orwell's book 1984, basically, because he created all of these kind of predictions, if you like, or these visions of a future that was quite dystopian, which in many cases the world seems to be going towards in a way. It's not that grim in terms of the outlook, but a lot of the things he predicted have come true in some parts of the world, i.e. like North Korea. That's like an embodiment of 1984. You should look into that. Yeah, so there's a lot of ideas. You just need to simplify. Here's a good tip for that one. So if you're finding that a text is overwhelming in terms of all the ideas and the intellectual ground that it's covering, simplify it down to a few key points in the plot, right? So, organizing your thinking. You're saying it's hard to organize our thinking at times. Absolutely. Fully empathize with that. So what you need to do is step back and say, what is this text about generally? Forget about the ideas. What happens in it? What's it about in the sense of what happens? Okay, in 1984, there's this guy. This is how you need to kind of say it to yourself. You need to be able to say this to yourself or something like this before you can take the next step and think about the deeper concepts. Okay, so 1984, it's about this guy who's living in this kind of weird world where there's control everywhere. There's this guy, there's this thing called Big Brother, and everyone's basically being observed all the time. And this guy, Winston, he lives in this world and he's constantly being watched. And everything he does is being monitored, and he's not allowed to speak his mind, and he's not allowed to say anything that goes against the government. And Big Brother seems to be the kind of government there. And anyway, he continues on, and he has this desire to express himself. He really wants to speak his mind. He wants to act in the way that feels natural to him, but it's all, if you do that in this world, you're basically killed or silenced. And no one, everyone's afraid to do that, because if they go against the instructions that they're being told, then they could die or be isolated. But anyway, he starts to do it, and he gets into a romantic relationship, which is forbidden. And then, he's eventually forced to turn against the woman he loves. And, at the end, he's potentially, it implies that he's killed in some way, and he basically ends up just losing himself and conforming to that government, and he becomes just another one of the slaves, right? Even that was way too long-winded and complex. So it's okay. There's this guy who is not allowed to think for himself because he lives in a world where everyone's controlled. Step 2, he rebels against that world, and he gets into a romantic relationship with someone, and that's forbidden. But the government then forces him to betray her and fall back in line with its own way of thinking. There you go. So it got simpler there, but you need to be able to describe what happens in that way, and then you can start linking the ideas to those plot points, right? So you might have a few plot points, but I would break down the plot points in terms of the problem, the struggle, and the resolution. So if you're looking at 1984, what's the problem? The problem is you've got a character, or you've got individuals, you've got a collective of individuals, really. It's everyone, right? Everyone in this society is not allowed to express themselves freely. Okay, that's the problem. Cool. You can explore the ideas around that, but just start with that basic kind of claim. Okay, your claim is that in 1984, no one is allowed to express themselves freely. Okay, then you start asking yourself, why? Oh, how does that look? Like, how is that enforced? And then you start coming up with examples, and suddenly you're building your first body paragraph. And then for the second body paragraph, you're thinking, okay, well, the second thing that happens in 1984, like in the middle of the story, you just do it in thirds, right? The middle of the story involves that character who's one of the individuals who's been oppressed, like everyone else, starting to rebel against Big Brother, against the government. And he does that through, psychological and sexual rebellion, right? And then you can start exploring ideas around that. So there's rebellion through psychological and sexual resistance or rebellion. You could say there's resistance through those types of rebellion, and then you could start unpacking that. Well, what does that look like? How is he rebelling psychologically? And then you start thinking about those elements. And then you think about the last third of the novel, and you think, is the rebellion successful? No, the rebellion's unsuccessful. So the rebellion's unsuccessful. Why? Well, it's unsuccessful because Big Brother has such a level of control, of absolute totalitarian control, that any form of resistance, of rebellion, even psychologically, is able to be observed and countered, right, with force, and with such force that you are ultimately destined to conform ideologically to Big Brother's will, right? And then you start asking questions around that, and further questions, and you go from there. But yeah, split the text up into a few key plot points, beginning, middle, end. Then think about, well, what ideas were explored in the beginning mainly? What are the main ideas in the middle? What are the main ideas in the end? And then ask yourself all of like the hows and the whys, and break that down into little components, find examples, and you'll start to see a nice 3-paragraph essay coming to life. Hope that helps. Okay. Yes. Do we need to revert back to reading the text in order to restructure our thinking about the text? I think start by just zooming out. If you're finding that the text is really difficult, don't just keep reading the text and going over it. That can be really overwhelming. That can make it worse, I would think. So I would start reading summaries. I would look at kind of video summaries as well. Watch some of the general videos on it, just an overview. Understand it from a really high level. And that means zoom out heaps and just be like, okay, this happens and this happens and this happens. This means that, this means that, this means that. Okay, all right, now I can kind of create an argument. And then you can start looking back at the text through that lens. So you need a simplified lens through which to view the text. So don't go back to the text until you understand the basics of the text. better. Excuse me. Okay. If an assessment task is due at the end of the term, when would you suggest to start in-depth analysis? Right now. No joke. If it is due at the end of the term, what you want to start close to the assessment is the polishing of an essay draft, for instance. What you want to start now is the actual analysis. Do not wait to do the analysis of your text. You typically only get 2 weeks notice before an assessment. Imagine starting to only do the analysis, let alone the essay or the assessment draft, 2 weeks before your assessment. So what I'm going to suggest is don't worry about making dot point notes on random things about your text. Start making your analysis tables. Okay, let me show you what an analysis table looks like. I'll just share my screen for a second. Here's an analysis table. This is what I do. This is what I do with students. So simple, so effective, right? Ooh, where are we doing? Here we go. Table, evidence, effect, or analysis, right? Your evidence might just be a quote if it's a written text, and your analysis would be your technique plus effect, right? You can do it in different ways. You could put the technique in here. It doesn't really matter. This is just one way of doing it. Here you go. Evidence effect. Okay, here's my quote example here. Great. Put them in chronological order. Page 1. Okay, that is a metaphor. And the metaphor means, so if you want to do an arrow, double equals forward arrow, then one of those forward arrows and then a space. And the metaphor means that we have, this is an example of psychological oppression for the individual. Okay, great. And then what I do after that, and I don't wait to do this before the assessment, is I would actually, after each piece of analysis here, I'm going to merge the cells and then I'm going to convert it into a full sentence. So I'm going to say the metaphor in quote example, whatever this thing was, whatever the quote was there, I'm going to put it here. And then I'm going to say that, I'm going to choose a verb here, reveals the psychological oppression of individuals, okay, and make sure you've done enough. I'll just put that in, and that's how you start framing it and make sure it's a full sentence. And then you've already got a base for all of your sentences of analysis when you get the assessment, and then you can put them into an appropriate essay structure. You could even start putting the essay draft together before you get the assessment notification. Okay, so you could start putting a draft together. And then if you get an assessment that's somewhat unrelated, at least you've got an essay draft. You're going to need to use that, and you'll have all the analysis there anyway, packaged up, polished, and then you can spend 2 weeks modifying things so they're completely relevant to the question you're being asked. Okay, so analysis tables, super key. I would be doing them right now. Every time you do another chapter in class or every time you do another section of your text, create the tables, get all the key quotes, get all the key aspects there, write a sentence of analysis for each quote that you pick. You don't have to pick everyone, just pick ones that you like or that you think are significant, put them in chronological order, and then by the end of the unit, after about a month or 5 weeks, when you've finished going through the text and it comes time for your assessment, you've already got all these nice polished sentences of analysis that you can then put into an essay structure if you haven't already. Okay. Let's see. Just reading through some of the comments. Here we go. Great book, 1984 for sure. Yeah, I'm still struggling with writing good topic sentences and how to use the directive verbs in the question to give a good response. What are your tips for this? So you're struggling with writing good topic sentences and how to use the directive verbs in the question to give a good response. Okay. The first thing I'm going to say on this, because there's two parts to that. You're struggling with writing a good topic sentence and how to use the directive verbs in the question to give a good response. Let's ignore the directive verbs for a second, because the directive verb application or implementation is far more subtle than writing a good sentence, right? Like, it's very obvious if you haven't written a good topic sentence. Whether you've used the precise directive verb like analyze, evaluate, yes, that might be obvious because some words like compare. If you haven't compared something and you just analyzed one thing and then analyzed another thing, that is quite obvious. But in most cases, you get something like analyze, examine, evaluate. It's very subtle as to the differences in how you word your response. Very subtle. Happy to cover some of them. There are some clear examples of where they're quite different, like compare. Well, you need to actually use language that compares. Whilst this text does this text does this. Whereas, comparatively, contrastingly, similarly, there's certain words. I just like to think about what kinds of words I would use for different directive verbs. So, if a directive verb, which is basically the word that typically starts the sentence of the question. So, for instance, if you get an essay question that says, compare how your prescribed text represents human experiences with your related text. Well, compare was the directive verb. It's the word right at the front of the question, just for those who are wondering. And in that case, you want to just use words like the ones I just said to show you are comparing, and they force you to, in fact, compare. So using the right words for different types of directive verbs helps, but I never paid that much attention to the directive verb, if I'm being honest, but it is very important, but it's very subtle in terms of the difference between a lot of the types there, right? Evaluate, analyze, examine. There's not a huge difference for a lot of them. Some, like compare, have their own little suite of words and vocabulary that you should be using to force yourself to do the right thing. But I won't spend too much time on that or any more time on that. Ask it later and remind me, and I can go through a more detailed examination of it. Don't stress too much about that. That's probably the last thing I would worry about. But if you're struggling with writing good topic sentences, that's more of an issue. Let me show an example of a bad topic sentence, and then I'll show an example of a good one. Hopefully it clears it up. It's not going to, teach you everything you need to know about a good topic sentence, because I'm going to do this in like a minute, but I can show you one example of the difference, right? Here's a band 4 topic sentence. So let's say this is band 4, or if you're from another system, this is a C grade or band 4 topic sentence, okay? Ready? Maybe it's lower. It's at most that, right? This is maximum mark, C grade or band 4 for a topic sentence, okay? Let's just say you were studying Shakespeare. A lot of people are familiar with Shakespeare. Here's your topic sentence. Shakespeare explores power and corruption in the play. Okay. Now, why is that band 4? Why is it not band 6? Why is it a C? Why is it not an A? Because here are a couple of pointers about it. First point is it is vague. It doesn't say anything specific. That's the key thing, right? If you want to write a good topic sentence, say something specific. It doesn't say anything specific. Okay. Number 2, list in. It lists 2 things rather than saying one thing meaningfully. Focus on one thing. Now, the one thing might feature those 2 words, and the way you do that is instead consider the relationship between the 2 buzzwords you have used, because they're buzzwords, right? Right, and I'm going to apply all of this step by step in a second, but that's another issue. And yeah, we can let's just focus on 2 things, okay? Don't be vague and don't list. Now, how do you not be vague? Well, the first thing is you grab the buzzwords that you've used here. Shakespeare explores corruption, okay? And then you ask a set of questions, okay? You ask a set of questions. So let's take these words again. Let's ask ourselves the right questions. Okay, here are the questions. What type of power, of corruption, right? Okay, let's answer it. What type of power? Well, maybe it's political power. Maybe it's psychological power. Try and use an adjective before it, and already when you write your answer, at least you're being specific about the type of power. You're using some kind of adjective before the key term that you're trying to use. Okay, so what type? There we go. That's the first one. Other questions that would be relevant are how is power enforced? Why is power used? Why is there corruption? And the last one, let me just go down here, organize this a little bit better. Why? So what? So what, how, why, so what? Ask yourself these questions in relation to the key words. Here are our key words. And that will force you to say something specific. Okay. The political power of what? Well, of who? I mean, maybe it's the political power of the state, meaning the government. Why don't we just say political power of religious institutions? I'm just making up an example of something that's specific. The political power of religious institutions. Okay, so it's an adjective, and then it's followed up with the word of, and then something specific. Okay, so little tricks to force yourself to be more specific. Now we want to try and answer a couple of these questions. Not all of these questions are going to be relevant. Maybe just answering one of those questions will force you or help you to say something more specific. But the second thing we want to do is we want to remove the end. Never use end, because that's forcing you to list, and you're convincing yourself that you're tricking yourself into thinking that you have said something more meaningful because you've added another buzzword, when in reality you've just added two buzzwords together, and now the whole thing is complicated, and it's worse than if you had just used one. So we need to focus on one thing meaningfully, but it can explore the relationship between two things. But we don't want to use end. Okay, we don't want to use commas and list things. So let's do our band 6 or our A grade example. Do it down here. Okay. So Shakespeare explores not power and corruption. Shakespeare explores. Here's a key little phrase that you can use to do it. And by the way, you can just use the author's name here and then explores here. For now, we might change this later, but when you're drafting it, it's important to do your topic sentences and other sentences as an incremental process. Don't try and do everything right at once. That's the worst thing you can try and do, okay? Because your mind's going to explode trying to consider all of those elements, right? I don't do that. What I do is I start with a basic thing. I focus on one thing at a time. Okay, Shakespeare explores. I don't want to think about the sentence starter. I'm just going to do Shakespeare explores. I'll probably end up changing that later, but I'm not worrying about it for now. Shakespeare explores. Here's a good little phrase: the way in which, because that's going to force me to say something more than just power. Shakespeare explores the way in which power. Now it doesn't make sense. It feels unfinished. Good, because it is unfinished. But you tricked yourself by not including that into thinking you'd actually said something that was finished. Shakespeare explores power. Shakespeare explores the way in which power. I have to fill it in. Good. Force yourself to do the right thing. Shakespeare explores the way in which. Now, we just gone with power? No, we're going to say what type of power. What type? Really powerful question to help you be more specific. Shakespeare explores the way in which political power, but I know I'm going to say of religious institutions. So to make that make sense, I have to say the. Shakespeare explores the way in which the political power of religious institutions can or is, we can play around with that, can corrupt individuals. Okay. Well, now you're making an actual argument. You're saying that the kind of political power of a religious institution can actually corrupt people. You're making a claim, you're making an argument. You're saying, I am arguing that political power of religious institutions can corrupt individuals. I'm going to argue that. That's my point. Saying Shakespeare explores power and corruption isn't an argument. You're not arguing anything. You wouldn't be able to say, I'm arguing that, and finish that sentence without knowing that you hadn't actually answered the question, right? And you hadn't said it. So Shakespeare explores the way in which, good little phrase there to force yourself to do the right thing. then be more specific around those keywords that you're using, and then actually show a relationship between the two keywords that you wanted to use rather than gluing them together. Never couple keywords together, separate them, and create a relationship between them. Okay. So just there, be more specific and focus on saying one thing properly. And the way to do that, if you have multiple key terms like power and corruption, is to separate them and show how they link together and just never say and or do commas with lots of theme words. Okay. If you can literally get good at doing those two things, your topic sentences are going to radically improve. So hopefully that helps with that. All right. All right, here we go. Just looking at some other comments. We've still got some people here. Thanks for sticking around, guys. Joined in late. Gee, it's me. What's the live session about? Just taking Q&As. I don't know if you're still here. No, that was a long time ago. I'm just scrolling through. Maybe I'm gonna jump all the way to the recent comments because yeah, what related? I can't go back over the other questions. You'll have to rewatch the stream if you've missed some things. Guys, we will publish this, but for those who are sticking around, I'm going to prioritize your questions. Jack, you submitted something in the forms. Did you submit it just now, Jack, or earlier? Because I do have a couple of things that I can look at. Just tell me what your question was in relation to. Here's a comment from Kush. I get drastically different feedback from English teachers in my school, and my marks fluctuate. I went from 19 to 13. Any tips? Well, it's no good if you're getting different feedback. Sometimes, you have too many voices, it gets tricky, but there shouldn't be that much variation. The fact you're getting a 19 in one assessment and then a 13 in another doesn't necessarily imply that, it's because of differences in teacher opinion. There was a different assessment. Maybe you just didn't perform as well on that assessment. I mean, that is possible. Sometimes you just understand intuitively one particular module better than another. Sometimes you try harder. But also, I take your point that sometimes you do get different teacher feedback and you try and do what one teacher likes, but then another teacher doesn't like that. I mean, any tips on that? I mean, if you can from a practical point of view, if you know who's marking an assessment, definitely try and reach out to get their feedback beforehand. But sometimes they're not going to tell you who's marking, anonymous submissions, anonymous marking, maybe. It's always ideal to kind of play into the preferences of the marker, obviously, play into the human biases that are inevitably at play in terms of the English course and any course you're doing. Except kind of like maths and some of the sciences where it's a bit more black and white. But unfortunately, subjectivity and differences of opinion is just part and parcel of English. And the name of the game is just to give the marker basically no doubt, or don't give the marker. Here's the key thing. Don't give the marker a reason to mark you down. Like, tick all the boxes. And by ticking all the boxes, it doesn't mean just include absolutely everything. It means include core things like context throughout, form throughout, links to the module throughout. You need to embed them. That's a lot of work. You need to make sure that your analysis is deep enough, right? That it's actually ordered and structured in the right way. Go and get feedback from teachers, but yeah, get feedback from other people as well. But if you've ticked enough of those core boxes and you're answering the question, this is the other thing. People might have a great essay, a 20 out of 20 draft, but then they don't respond properly to the question on the day of their assessment, if it was an in-class one, and they wonder how they got a 13 or a 14. Not saying that's the case with you, Kush, but that can happen. Sometimes people are shocked. I had someone come back to me and they said, "Oh, I thought we had this like perfect essay." I said, "You did have a perfect essay." But they said, "Oh, but I only got this mark. I didn't get full marks." And I said, "Let me see what you wrote." It looks nothing like, first of all, it looked nothing like what we had prepared. And second of all, they hadn't actually answered the new question. And that's a skill you need to practice consciously, right? You can't just go and regurgitate a memorized essay and think you're going to get full marks, even though it was a perfect essay for a different question. So that's that skill of adapting to a question and knowing how to respond to a given question, and also having the openness to do that. You have to be willing to do it. part of you won't want to do it. You'll just want to take the easy path and just rewrite what you already know. But that will cost you marks. So there are a few kind of things, a few things there. Abdel Salam, you're saying I skipped everything. I skipped everything in what sense? I did skip a lot of questions if that's what you're saying. But is this your question? Collective power fundamentally limits individual agency. To what extent do you agree with this statement in relation to your prescribed text and one related merchant? Any ideas? Are you asking in relation to that question? I'm going to go through a question breakdown thing in a second. Collective power limits individual agency, for sure. So I'll tell you how to break down a question in a moment. I'll do that in a second. I'm just going back, making sure I haven't missed anything critical. Appreciate that, Jack. And the question was, it was an essay question I got. I wanted to see how you would interpret it. I put it in when the stream started. No stress. Okay. No, I definitely want to get to it. Just bear with me. Just can you repost the question in the chat, Jack? Just repost the question in the chat. Because if you put it in the forms late, yeah, I may have missed it. How to write concisely if your school expects 4 body paragraphs for an essay plus an amplification sentence per paragraph. An amplification sentence. I love how these new concepts come about, these new types of sentences. States where the evidence is in the play. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if you can't write 4 body paragraphs in the time that you're given, don't try and write 4 body paragraphs. Okay? It's all about how much you can write in the time that's allocated. Faster writers have an advantage. So try and get as fast as you can at actually writing, handwriting. This is if it's a handwritten assessment. But if you've got a word limit, like 1,000 words or 900 words, and it's a typed assessment and you have time to refine it, then how to write concisely, I mean, you have to make sure you get rid of all the fluff. What is the fluff? I mean, you just go to that kind of bare bone structure of, here's my topic sentence, here's my point, next sentence. Okay, what's the first aspect of the form that you want to talk about or style, and then bring in a quote straight away and explain the meaning of that, and then bring in a couple of other ones and then link it back to the question, and that's the end of your paragraph. I would only have 3 pieces of evidence per paragraph if I was doing 4. But I also wouldn't push for 4 again if you're doing a handwritten assessment with times conditions and you know personally that you aren't able to do that in the time. Well, you're just going to have an incomplete essay and you'll go worse if that happens. So just do 3 if that's all you can do in the time. Try and improve the speed of your handwriting if that's something you are truly expected to do. Although it's always more important that you finish the essay properly than trying to do too much and having an incomplete essay, for sure. And also just get rid of all the fluff. Like, don't worry about storytelling at any point. Just keep it purely analytical. This technique in this quote means this. Next. This technique in this means this. Next. Then work on the flow and mixing up the way you word those sentences so it's not overly repetitive, but get rid of all the sentences or parts of sentences where you're just telling us what happened. Okay? Get rid of all the descriptions. Try and integrate plot references in a very subtle and efficient way. Few words. Say what character said a particular quote, and say in a few words like how they were feeling or when that was. Like, when this happened, that's only a few words. They said this, and that technique means this. So just keep it very analytical. All right. Okay, so how will we be able to use a contrasting protagonist? Aisha Saeed, how will we be able to use a contrasting protagonist for my related text? Well, you just have to find what is your prescribed text? So here we go. How Shylock from The Merchant of Venice internalized the racism and allowed his anger to fuel his motivation. Try and understand. I see. Then you've got this. Unlike Robertson the film, who used the racial prejudice as motivation, allowing him to succeed, becoming the best baseball player as the first one. Right. Okay. And that's an example where if you're asked to contrast 2 characters from related text, then you have to do that. It sounds like you already know the main argument. You just have to present those different ideas that, whereas Shylock's oppression motivates him to become an oppressor himself, paradox, in Robertson, the film 42, the oppression of the protagonist, the racial prejudice set against the protagonist, motivates them to transcend society's expectations and realize their highest potential as an individual. Perfect. There's your thesis, there's your introductory sentence, and then you just break up those components into your different paragraphs and provide examples. Hopefully that helps. Okay. Here we go. So Jack says, and yes, I have a couple of questions that people put in the forms, but some people have been like Jack, been watching this for a while, so I'm just gonna shift you up a little bit until I move on to the sheet. This will be the last thing I look at. I mean, obviously, if you've got other questions, I'll come back. I'm gonna do another one of these. I'll do one next week, most likely. And guys, remember, if you're still watching this, Jettle Mastermind is a game show where you can win up to $100. Okay, you can win up to $100, maybe more with the new structure we're doing, and you can just jump on, answer a few questions about English, and you can potentially win that. It's a YouTube game show. So Mastermind, look up Mastermind on YouTube, and you'll see in the description the application form if you want to be on the show. Again, it's like 20 minutes. It's online. So jump on Mastermind. We're actually filming this Saturday. We're doing an episode. So whoever is keen to come on a game show, do a few questions. It's with other, students who are currently doing exams or they're in year 12 or another year group maybe. But it's good fun. So jump on Mastermind. And if you're interested in our comprehensive resources for year 12 or any other year, we're now doing all years for English. Jump onto jettle.com, and if you subscribe, you get access to all of our most extensive examples, written examples, question breakdowns, exemplar essays, textual analysis in tables of analysis already ready to go. So make sure you check that out. That's on jettle.com, our website. That's for our most comprehensive resources to prepare you for your exams and assessments. Okay, so Jack, just looking at your question, of course, the journey is not all dark, as we know the human experience is one of light and shade, right? Light and shade. Shade's an interesting word, right? Light would represent good. Shade is that middle ground, that space in between that could be good, could be bad. It's that potential that we all live within. And the question then says, to what extent does this statement represent your understanding of George Orwell's 1984 and One Text of Your Own Choosing? Okay, so just quick breakdown of that question before I look at what you're saying there in terms of your ideas on that, right? Just the way I'd break it down. Of course, the journey is not all dark. You're getting like a prompt, an excerpt here, not an excerpt from the text, but a prompt, a quote that they want you to respond to. So does this represent your understanding? Well, when you get something like this, it's presenting a position and you're allowed to disagree and agree with it. And it's always good to do a bit of both, right? Especially if you get a really definitive statement. So if something says 1984 is not about love at all, well, you can say how it's not about love, but then you can also say it is about love in this way. So it's always good to disagree a little bit because that provides nuance to your argument. It shows that you're thinking about the complexities of the issue, that not everything is just black and white, so to speak here. I mean, dark, light, and a shade, right? So if I was relating this quote to 1984, which a lot of people would think is just all dark because there is no hope seemingly at the end. It's all dark. There's no shade or light. You have to think about how is there some light? You don't have to say it's fully about light. You can make it clear implicitly where you sit on that. You can say, look, predominantly this world is one of darkness, but there is also light in this way. There's also shade here. There's shades of uncertainty. There's lights of hope. Try and expand on those words as well, like I just did, right? Like the darkness of totalitarianism. See how I'm putting of after those words? The light of hope that emanates from or that stems from or derives from this. Like, where does the light come from in the text? And shades, the shades of possibility that come with rebellion. Now, those shades of possibility, those shades of potential autonomy, those shades of potential agency that come from rebellion are overshadowed, or ultimately overshadowed, by the darkness, by the absolute darkness of totalitarian control under Big Brother. Right? See what I'm doing there? I'm acknowledging that there appears to be light, right? And there's shades of possibility. The shades of possibility there, but it's ultimately overshadowed. I'm leaning into the language of that quote, right? Overshadowed. Shadowed is to do with shade, light, dark. It's overshadowed by the absolute totalitarian control, right? So that might be your argument, but you need to acknowledge where the light exists and the shade. And I would say by the end of the novel, 1984, there is a huge shade of uncertainty in that the appendix, which a lot of students ignore, actually implies the difficulty and potential impossibility of eradicating all language under Big Brother's control, that it's so hard to remove deeply embedded language out of the collective psyche that by 2050, because it projects forward into 2050 in the appendix, so after the end of the novel, after the end of the story, it implies that Big Brother hasn't yet been able to eliminate all language. So there's like this tiny semblance of hope there. A little bit of light remains at the end of the story there. Anyway, few things there to think about in terms of how you approach the question, how you structure your argument around that. But I think it's a nice question. A lot to do with that. Hope that helps. Yeah, the shade again. That's the potential, which maybe is illusory. It's an illusion. There for Winston, he thinks there's a shade of hope. He thinks that by engaging in rebellion with Julia and engaging with O'Brien and the Brotherhood and immersing himself in this intellectual rebellion, he thinks that there's this potential for some kind of what would you call it? Overthrowing of and complete subversion of the system that Big Brother continues to perpetuate in society, to enforce in society. And then you've got to say that ultimately that shade of possibility is overshadowed, right? Or however, there remains that little bit of light at the end, which creates new shades, right? So the shades they may be an illusion, they may be real, but you have to talk about how humans are motivated to lean into the shade, right? Especially in times of darkness. Humans are motivated to find a glimmer of light in the shade of possibility that lies in the expression of self, that lies in rebellion. We aren't programmed to just succumb straight away. There's some part of us that resonates with us, from Winston's behavior. There's a part of Winston's rebellion that resonates with all of us, that we wouldn't just give up, that we are, as humans, we are programmed and conditioned. We're wired as humans to find some semblance of hope in the darkest of times. And we'll cling on to any shade of possibility to try and find the light at the end of that tunnel. Of course, because 1984 is a dystopian text, it shows that darkness kind of wins. But at least in the appendix, there's kind of a final shade of ambiguity there that implies maybe there is still hope. And of course, that's what Orwell wants you to think, because he wrote this, 1949. He's saying, look, I'm presenting this horrible world, but we're not there just yet. And it's not too late. You better get a move on. You better start questioning. You better start challenging. You better stand up for yourself and voice your own opinion and exercise your own freedoms. So plenty to work with there, I hope, for you. Aisha wants me to answer Abdel Salam's question. Now, apologies, Abdel Salam, if I just... I apologize if I skip things. So you made a thesis for a question that said, individuals subjected to racial prejudices within a xenophobic society often develop motivations of revenge, resulting in collective powers stripping minorities of their humanity and agency. Okay, let's break it down. It's quite wordy. Looks like you've got some substance there. So this is in relation to collective power fundamentally limits individual agency. Collective power. Okay, who is the collective here? Who represents the collective? That's what I would want to know. Fundamentally limits individual agency. Well, who is the individual and how does it limit it? How is the key word to unpack there? How does it limit individual agency? In what way? Are you not able to think for yourself? Are you forced to conform to the behaviors of others? Are you forced to betray your own personal values? These are things you need to consider. But going back to your answer, individuals subjected to racial prejudice within a xenophobic society often develop motivations of revenge. Okay, individuals subjected to racial prejudice within a xenophobic society. I mean, yeah, you're being specific about who the individuals are. They're the individuals who are subjected to racial prejudice within this kind of society. That's good. Good specificity. Often develop motivations of revenge, resulting in collective powers stripping minorities of their humanity and agency. So a bit of a leap there. Like the specificity is good in the first sentence there. Individuals subjected often develop motivations of revenge. Fantastic, great. I would then ask, so what? And you've kind of answered that after, but then I think you've kind of lost me with the cohesion of the argument. So, okay, an individual, look, let's put it in simple terms. Someone who is discriminated against wants to get revenge. That's your first claim. And then your second claim is the consequence of that. Here's why you should care. The consequence of someone wanting to get revenge because they were discriminated against is that collective powers are going to strip minorities of their humanity and agency. It's just what collective powers are you still? How does that connect back to the individuals and the society? I don't know which collective powers you're talking about. You were just talking about how someone wants to get revenge if they're discriminated against, and then you say it results in some other collective powers. I don't know who that is or what that is, stripping minorities. What minorities of their humanity? So there's a disconnect between those two clauses. So that thesis needs a lot of tidying up from the perspective of cohesion. There's nice specificity in the first part. The second part's too vague. You don't say what collective. What collective? What are collective powers? It's a vague term. You need to define that. And then you say it strips minorities. Yeah, break up collective and powers. There's a tip for you. Break up collective and powers. Just say resulting in define the collective, resulting in what kind of collective, stripping minorities of their humanity and agency. The other issue is you've done the double up problem. So you've said humanity and agency. Well, agency is part of humanity. One of those terms is redundant. I would probably just go with agency, but you don't want to use two words separated by and almost ever. Sometimes and works, but in this case, make it a rule of thumb. Rule of thumb, there are some exceptions. This isn't one, where you don't double up with multiple nouns like that. You don't list. You just say one thing and you say it well. That's the key principle. So you've got to remove humanity and just make minorities of their agency. But again, that is, in my eyes, it's disconnected to the first part of that sentence. So you need to work on giving me something that makes more sense. Hopefully that makes sense to you in terms of that feedback, but we need more of a connection there. What's this one? Jack, thank you. You answered all my questions. Great. Also, where can I buy coaching? Well, excuse me. Coaching from me, I mean, I run a few. The website is where we have all of our resources. So everything that, I've built, the team's built, teachers have built, it's all on there. But they're locked into the site. Personal tutoring from me, send me an email. It's very limited. I only do a few just to, I like to keep sharp with it, of course, but also I'm mainly putting all my attention into building more and more resources to put onto the online platform. We're also building, this is exciting, only a few of you here, I'll share it with you, early days. We're also building a feedback and marking platform that's going to allow for you to get on-demand feedback. Like if you wanted to get amazing feedback, the night before an assessment or a couple weeks before an assessment, or just 1 week, 1 week into a certain unit, and you're like, I want to make a head start, I'm going to submit a paragraph. You can get feedback from a variety of sources, including AI, basically on demand, okay, through the community. So we're building that. If you're interested, for now, you can just send me an email to make sure you're in the first group that goes into that system. But That's what we're building. That's what majority of my time's going. To answer your question though, Jack, shoot me an email if we can make something work. We'll do it. Just use the contact form on the Jettle website, Jack. Just use the contact form, and I'll send you through the dates. But might not be possible. Possibly is if we act soon on that. But otherwise, yeah, just use the resources on the platform and all the other stuff we've got coming out. But yeah, anyone else watching this, if you're interested in getting accelerated feedback and marking throughout the year, send me an email, expression of interest, and we'll make sure that you are kept in the loop about that. Little secret on the side, but been working on it for over a year. Okay, so Venetian Christian Society is the collective power. So Aisha, that's to the other response. Okay, so great. Well, you should say that. You should say that. Now, you might not want to be that specific in your very first sentence. So it's always a balancing act between how specific are you in the very first sentence, because maybe it's in the next sentence that you're going to be more specific and say the Christian. So you just need to get that balance. Maybe you don't need to mention the Christian Society, but my point was generally the idea in that second part resulting from didn't match up with the first part. So you just need a much clearer connection to say what the consequence is. Try starting the sentence with whilst. So whilst individuals who are discriminated against are motivated for revenge, this happens. Like, what's the flip side? Or use the word however after. So individuals are motivated to enact revenge. However, this leads to this, and make it really clear what the downside of that is. So that's my advice, is just to reframe that essay, that response a little bit. But if you come up with an updated version, submit it on the next Q&A we do, and I'll have a look and see if it has improved. But that's the way I would think about that. All right, cool. So let's finish up here. So I'm going to present. Here we go. I'm going to present this sheet here. Hopefully this is showing for you. And let's go through it. So how do we break down this question? One student asked, how does Beach Burial, which is a poem by Kenneth Slessor, portray the collective human experience of death? So how does it portray the collective human experience of death? Okay, well, have a look at this. Step one, we've got to identify the key term of the question. Now, a lot of people, when I say identify the key term, they say, oh, it's how. It's how. It's this word. No, we're not talking about the directive word or the how or the why. We're talking about the word that you're going to try and use all throughout your response, okay? So that is death. That clearly is the key idea or theme word that it's asking about. Sometimes there are two. Often there are two. Sometimes there are three. If you think there are more than three key terms, like really important terms that you have to use all the way throughout your essay, you're overvaluing certain words. You need to really look at the question and think, what's it really about? This question is clearly about the representation of death. Nice, easy key term at the end of the question, okay? Sometimes it'll say, how does the form of beach burial portray that? Okay, then form is also a key word. I need to make sure I talk about that a lot. But here it's just, how does the text portray the collective experience of death? It is saying collective, so that's also somewhat key. It's good to have a little priority structure in your head. To me, death is clearly the centerpiece of this question, and then collective is an important type of human experience that it also wants me to focus on, but it's all around death. So number one is death, number two is collective. I'll try and use those a lot, right? So have a kind of little priority structure there. Maximum 3 keywords. Often it's 2. Sometimes it's 1, but usually with year 12, it's going to be at least 2 keywords in a question. Sometimes they'll come in the form of a quote. Sometimes they will be a little phrase or an informal word because it's someone's opinion. They've quoted someone's opinion about a text, and you have to say to what extent do you agree. So there are those little caveats to it, but yeah, there's only a couple of keywords. I'm not talking about how. These are the words we want to expand upon, right? Because once you've identified the keyword, then we need to expand or unpack the key terms, right? So now we're thinking about death, and how do we expand, unpack? We do that through mini questions. Okay, so death, what type? What type of death? Death of who? Who? How do they die? Why do they die? Who dies? So what did they die? Right? You just got to ask these questions. You don't have to answer all of them, but this is the kind of thought process that you quickly go through. And then collective. Let's just ask the most relevant of those questions above. What collective? What collective? Who is the collective? Okay. Cool. Then kind of you relate key terms together. So collective and death, we need to kind of find a relationship between them. Well, because beach burials referring to the death of collective at war, we know that we're talking about collective death, right? Collective death, but you can also relate that to the individual and other key terms as well. But yeah, we are talking about collective death at war. So there's our little, that's the way we're going to relate them together. Okay, so yeah, if you're talking about beach burial from Slessor, it's got a couple of good concepts or interesting concepts to do with death. First of all, is that death can be the product of collective disharmony. There's the disharmony, right? There's the relationship. Death can be the product of collective disharmony, right? And death is non-discriminatory in the sense that everyone is vulnerable to death. So why don't we say that? Collective. The human collective is forever vulnerable to the whims of death, right? Death can just take your life at any point, really, like it can. Death can be the product of collective disharmony, i.e. war, okay, conflict. What else? It goes on to say that death is a unifier. However, so it's always good to have a however. You need to have a however to show the nuance in your argument. However, death is the ultimate unifier for the collective, as it transcends perceived differences. People think that they're different and they fight over those differences. Oh, we believe in different gods. Oh, like we're fighting over land. And I'm not trivializing. I'm not trying to trivialize those conflicts because they're very real, as we know. Just look at any time in history, right? That's what all the wars are built around: power, land, God. So it's not trivial in the sense that it does result in death. But if you think about it from a super high level, it's like, it's kind of ridiculous because like we're all human at the end of the day, and we all could have been born into the other person's family and circumstances and then believed exactly what they believe. So it doesn't make things any easier in the real world, but interesting concept that when you die, you're back to nothing. And and I'm saying nothing just in one sense of that word, but you are no thing in the sense you're no material thing anymore. You've lost your human form, at least, irrespective of what happens or you believe to happen after that. But you do lose your material form and circumstances, and they were the things that were separating you. So now you're all the same. It transcends perceived differences between individuals, cultures, etc. And it's perceived differences. You think you're different, but you're probably not that different. Okay. And they are also irreconcilable differences in many cases, which is what brought death on in the first place. Okay, that's that breakdown. Just going to check in on my chat. Aisha, can you also break down this one? I'm going to finish soon, so let me just go on to one more here. This one was interesting because it's the same question that someone asked about as the 2023 HSC question from Common Mod. So a text can ignite ideas about collective human experiences that enrich our view of the world. That's taken directly from, here's the 2023 paper. People just sat this a few weeks ago. Sorry about the PTSD if there's anyone from the 2023 cohort looking at this. Here was the essay question for the Common Mod. A text can ignite ideas about collective human experiences that enrich our view of the world. So it's basically what that student asked about. They got asked to respond to that in relation to 1984. I don't want to make this too text specific so it can help everyone. So let's break down the HSC question that just got asked a few weeks ago. This is going to be you guys, if you're watching this and you're going to do the HSC next year. Maybe you're not even doing the HSC, but if you're watching this could be you and you'll have to answer a question like this. So let's break it down. I'll just make sure a text can ignite ideas. A text can ignite ideas about, yes, that enrich our view of the world. Okay, cool. So There you go. This is the 2023 HSC question. All right. A text can ignite ideas about collective human experiences that enrich our view of the world. Interesting thing about the 2023 HSC question was how broad it was. Super broad. It wasn't specific to any text. Notice here, it says, to what extent do you agree with this statement in relation to your prescribed text? So again, your related text will not be asked in the, or will not be included in the question for your HSC paper. It just says prescribed text, one text. Make close reference to your prescribed text. So we're only talking about, 1984 or The Crucible or Slessor or whatever you're studying, Merchant of Venice, one of those common module texts. And it's a very broad question. Sometimes you get a question that asks specifically about your text. It talks about a character, or probably less likely to be a character, but a theme. It talks about a particular idea and how that is explored in the text that you've studied. So you can get a question that's specific to a text or that is broader about the general module of human experiences. So if we're thinking about the common module, human experiences, this question is derived directly from that rubric, collective human experiences. There it is. Collective human experiences. All right. That was one of the key words for sure, because that's the type of human experience. I'm not going to highlight human experiences here because if I was in an exam, I'm thinking, what are the main words here? Well, obviously the fact it's collective, and text can ignite. I'm just looking at the thing. I want to thank you, NOPAC. Appreciate that. I think, not sure. That enrich our view of the world. So it's enriching. Something's enriching our view. It's the responder's view of the world. All right. Well, how does it enrich our view? How does it change our view of the world? So that's obviously important. And also, a text can ignite ideas about collective human experiences. I could highlight ideas, but if we're already marking collective human experiences, I might highlight the whole thing for that reason. We're, of course, going to unpack it in relation to ideas. So I think that's all I've got to highlight. No worries, Nisa. Appreciate it. So how does the text ignite those ideas? I mean, I guess the other aspect that a lot of students would have missed here is it's saying a text can ignite those ideas. How does it do that? Like, that actually relates to the form of the text, I believe, as well. Okay, so few key questions come out from it. So collective human experiences, what are they? What are they? If you're doing 1984, collective experience of conformity, of prejudice, if it's Merchant of Venice, if it's Crucible, of we could say, I mean, conformity is certainly another one for the Crucible, but another one in Crucible would be the fact that everyone experiences hysteria. Okay, you could chuck out another prescribed text, and we'd be able to come up with a couple of general answers to it, right? But these are just buzzwords. You have to define them, remember, when you use them, but they're a good starting point for thinking about the question, okay? So collective human experiences, what? There we go. All right, what about enrich our... By the way, I'm actually going to tell you something really important here. When we think about collective human experiences, think about how to unpack that, because it's the question, it's the main term of the question. Think about how to unpack that in relation to the different sections of your essay scaffold or draft. So if your draft establishes a problem that is to do with oppression, and then it has a struggle or consequence, this is the second body paragraph, and it talks about rebellion, okay? And then the third one is about the futility of rebellion, that it's hopeless, that everything's hopeless, right? Okay, because that's the say no, it's futile. Okay, here are the three ideas that you had for all of your three body paragraphs. But because the question is all about collective human experiences, you want to immediately apply that to each body paragraph idea or focus that you already had, and that will allow you to preserve your draft essay to a much greater extent. You want to make the question work for your essay, not the other way around. The question works for you. You've got a draft, you know your core ideas. How do I interpret this in the most convenient way possible? Well, if I'm interpreting collective here, clearly oppression is collective. It's collective oppression. There we go. I've merged in the key word. Struggle, response. Okay, there's a rebellion. What type of rebellion? Is it a collective rebellion? No, it's an individual rebellion, right? In the face of collective. Now, we don't want to say oppression again, but there's individual rebellion, possibly in the hope of, maybe we say in the hope of, and you have to kind of come up with this on the spot, in the hope of a collective uprising. So people will rebel as individuals in the hope of the collective all rebelling, if they're oppressed. Notice how they tie in, right? But notice how I'm getting collective in here into each one. And the futility of rebellion, well, the futility of rebellion comes because if rebellion is not, it's like unless rebellion is collective, then the individual pursuit of autonomy or freedom is futile. So you see how we're incorporating that word collective into all of our arguments, right? And you can relate the individual human experiences to it in each case, but you're still able to preserve your fundamental arguments, and therefore all of your evidence is still relevant. You just have to tie in these words more. Now, of course, you then have to incorporate the enrich our view of the world. The link sentence would always be a really good way of doing that, but obviously in the introduction and topic sentences, it's good to engage with that part of the question as well. And of course, the text part. But yeah, how do these collective experiences enrich our view of the world? Well, what do we learn? That's what it's saying. What's the enrichment? How are we enriched? We learn that we are exposed to, right? Or yeah, we are enriched because we are exposed to because really in colloquial terms, it's the worst case scenario, right? Of what we're exposed to. We're exposed to the kind of totalitarian, the extreme, the dangers of totalitarian control. Okay, that relates to the oppression. In terms of the enrichment for this one, this is about rebellion. So we are kind of empowered to, or we are inspired to maintain our autonomy. Okay, because of what's going on. We're inspired by the text to do that. By the text, that links the text in. And then what's the enrichment at the end? Despite the seemingly futile outlook of the world, it nonetheless enriches us with a sense of urgency to act as a collective and challenge totalitarian ideals or something like that. Okay, good. So you see how we're getting the different parts of the question in there. Sorry, I haven't done the highlighting accurately in terms of the colors, but hopefully you get the point. I'm going to fix these up because that's going to annoy me. But yeah, look, that's a good breakdown of that one, and that'll be the last one I look at. But yeah, in terms of the text, how does it do that? Just relate that to form, maybe because it's a dystopian text. What about why is the form of the text relevant here? Well, maybe the form of the text in relation to its style, like it's humanized, it's got like a focalized narrative perspective. Winston for 1984. And then what type of text here? Well, it is a speculative, satirical text. So it's cautionary. There you go. So I've got the properties of the text in there as well, a different one for every paragraph. I've linked it to our pre-existing arguments. So everything we had in the draft essay is completely relevant still because we framed the question around our pre-existing structure and ideas, and we didn't rush in and just start writing a new introduction. Always start by considering what are the keywords, how do they relate to each key idea I have in my paragraphs, and then you can go from there and start writing the intro and tweaking things there as well. Anyway, there's obviously a lot to unpack here, so many like micro skills involved in perfecting this art. But if you can understand some of the principles I'm going through, hopefully that will help you with your marks. Thank you very much. Any last questions? I mean, I probably shouldn't even ask for more questions. What I'll say is I will do another one of these sooner rather than later. I've enjoyed going through this with you. Hope you did get a lot of value. Thank you very much, Jack. Appreciate that. Guys, our content, jettle.com, that's our most extensive content. As I said, exciting stuff coming soon. Feedback platform, marking platform for you guys. Stay tuned, follow the socials, and mastermind, play the game show. You can win up to $100. It's like 20 minutes, it's online. Go to a mastermind episode, type in Jettle Mastermind. There's a link in the description. Put in your information to apply, and you could be in an episode of Mastermind, which is pretty cool. Encourage you all to do it. Thanks, Jack. Looking forward to it. Guys, jettle.com, all our best resources. Thanks very much. Good luck. Congratulations to everyone who just finished their HSC. Nice to check in. CP, huge shout out. Send me an email, CP. Appreciate that. We'll have to hook you up with something. I'll give you priority on Mastermind. How about that? You want to come on Mastermind? Refer back to this. I'll make sure you get in this Saturday, or at a time in an episode that suits you. Look forward to it. Okay, I'm getting told to shush by Nisa. That's not very nice, but I'll take it. I'll take it on the chin. Good night, guys. See you soon.